Interpreting the meaning of the Second Amendment of the United States Constitution's Bill of Rights isn't rocket science. Let me explain why. As we move along through this video, if you're enjoying it and getting something out of it, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Now let's move on to what I want to talk about here regarding the Second Amendment. This is the first in a series of videos, and what I want to do in these videos is to look at the debate over the Second Amendment, not from how people want to interpret it now, but on how it was interpreted at the time, how it was interpreted then, because that's really what's important. And I'm not just going to look at the period of the Constitution and the immediate passage of the Bill of Rights. I'm going to look at the colonial period that preceded it, and also how the various states up to about 1820 interpreted the ideas of the right to bear arms in their own state constitutions, and earlier at the time of ratification in their ratification conventions. Because if you look at all these things in the entire picture, I don't think there's any possible debate about what they meant when they wrote the Second Amendment. I guess a good place to start would be to actually look at the text of the Second Amendment. It's only a single sentence, so I'm going to read it, and I'll show it to you as well. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, shall not be infringed. Let me repeat that. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Simple enough. Why the confusion? To a degree, it is a little confusing. And to understand why, all we need to do is to look at the background to what became the Bill of Rights. The men who drafted the Constitution were trying to keep it, relatively speaking, lean. So they didn't put into it things that they thought everybody understood. Everybody already knew. But for the Constitution to go into effect, 9 of the 13 states had ratified. And you have to understand that the states were giving up a system under the Articles of Confederation in which each state had one vote, an equal vote, the biggest state and the smallest vote, and each state held veto power. So especially the small states were worried because they knew they were giving up a lot of the power they held under the Confederation. So to convince all these people in the states to support the Constitution as drafted, the Federalists, the guys who had drafted it, basically had to make concessions, promises, because each state held a ratification convention. And it wasn't clear which way some of these conventions were going to go. And they needed 9 of the 13 states. And they especially needed the big, powerful states like Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, New York, and especially Virginia to go along. And this was not a sure thing. So each of the states raised issues. And to counter that, the Federalists, the drafters, made promises that if these states voted to ratify, and adopt the Constitution, once the Congress met, they would use the amendment process to add these things to the Constitution so that they would be spelled out exactly, succinctly in the document itself. That was what gave birth to the Bill of Rights. The problem was, when that process began, there were over 200 amendments that they had to deal with. So one of the things that they did was to lump bunches of these amendments into a single amendment. For example, the First Amendment includes, religion, speech, assembly, protest, the press. These were all separate ideas which were pushed into one. The same happened with the Second Amendment. There were basically 2 ideas, one about militias, one about the right to bear arms, which were pushed into a single sentence. And that's why it looks like it does. What I want to do next is to look at 3 aspects of a Second Amendment. First is its structure. The second is its use of a phrase, to bear arms. And the third is the use of the word arms specifically. Because each of those give us clues into how they were looking at this thing. If you look at the structure, the actual structure of a Second Amendment, which is only a single sentence, you'll see that there are two parts. There's the clause, and then there's the sentence itself. The clause is a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. It's a clause. It's not a complete sentence. What is a complete sentence? The second part. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That's a complete sentence. It can stand alone. The clause cannot. So right away, that would suggest to you that the controlling element of the sentence is the second part, which is the complete part. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That seems simple. It seems obvious. But let's take it another step to make it even more obvious. What's the first part of a sentence? Because that's the argument of the people who want more gun control, is that this is somehow related to the militia and that bearing arms is dependent on the militia. And that's the first part. But what is the first part? A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. What's that talking about? Is that talking about a right, or is it talking about a responsibility? If you're an armed citizen, you have a responsibility to serve in the militia. Responsibility is the key. What's the second part? The complete sentence in the Second Amendment. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That's a right. It says it. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Right. Right is the key word here. Now, where is the Second Amendment located in the Constitution? Is it in something called the Bill of Responsibilities? Or is it in something called the Bill of Rights? And of course, it's in the Bill of Rights. So if it's in the Bill of Rights, again, what's the dominating element of the sentence, which is the Second Amendment? That's the second part. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That's why it's in the Bill of Rights. If the focus was on the first part, it should be in something called the Bill of Responsibilities, because the first part is about responsibilities and not rights. So there's another clue for you if it hasn't settled the whole issue in your mind already. It's a right. It's not a responsibility. And it's the second part which discusses the right and outlines the right and enumerates the right. Let's look at the phrase bear arms, to bear arms. What does that mean, to bear arms? What were they rebelling against? What was the form of government in Europe at the time that they were trying to distinguish themselves from? Monarchy, aristocracy. Now, if you look at monarchies and aristocracies as they developed out of the feudal system, who in those societies had the right to bear arms? The nobility. You were a nobleman, you could walk around with a sword on. You carry a dagger. In much of the medieval period, the feudal period, and it varies from time to time and place to place, the clergy, who did the basically administrative work for the aristocrats, who didn't want to actually do any work, had a right to bear arms. Now, if you don't know any medieval history, maybe you've seen the movie Robin Hood. Friar Tuck is a swordsman. He's a clergyman, and he has a right to bear arms. Who doesn't have a right to bear arms in a feudal state, in an aristocratically dominated state? The people. The people are the only ones who don't have a right to bear arms. They can't walk around with a sword, or they'll get in trouble. So if you look at the choice of the words here, bear arms, what they're trying to do with the Second Amendment is to democratize the ability to defend yourself. Because in the old aristocratic system, and remember, what are the aristocrats? How do they tell each other apart when they're on a battlefield? What do they have? What's it called? A coat of arms. It's a coat of arms, A-R-M-S. Bearing arms. That's what it's all about. They have a monopoly, along with the clergy, the first and the second estates, if you look at it from a French point of view, to bear arms, and the people do not. So what the founders are trying to do, and what they're doing here with the Second Amendment, is to ensure that the people themselves share that right, previously held by the aristocrats and the clergy, Now the people are going to have a right to bear arms. So the Second Amendment is an attempt at Republican government to basically democratize the right to bear arms to defend yourself. Because in a feudal system, if you're a peasant, you're a serf, you're not as bad as a slave, but you don't really have a right to defend yourself. And you've all seen movies and read books about the medieval period where the poor peasants are being, throttled and killed and raped and all these other things because they're not allowed to defend themselves. That's what it's all about. And what they're saying here is they're trying to extend that right to the people so that they can defend themselves. And it's interesting today, if you look at the groups, intellectuals, the elites in this country, want to go back to the feudal period. They don't want the right to bear arms themselves, but they will hire armed security. And the rest of us, we're going to have to rely on the police, who are going to now be defunded. But that's a whole other video. Now let's look at the word arms itself. Now, you've all seen people who say, well, this means, you have a right to use a smoothbore musket. No, that's exactly the point they were trying to make. The founders, the people who drafted this, the people who amended the Constitution, knew their history. That's why they used the term arms instead of musket or smoothbore musket. They knew throughout history the weapon people would use to defend themselves had evolved. If you go back far enough, people would walk around with a stick. And then they'd sharpen the stick into a spear. And eventually they made, the bow with the arrow, clubs with stone handles, and then eventually, copper or bronze, tin swords, and then iron, steel, and then small pistols, and eventually muskets. They understood this. So that's why they didn't limit themselves to what they were using at the time. It just says arms, because they would assume that in 100 years, there'd be a different form of weapon that people would carry to defend themselves. The other thing to keep in mind, and you hear this a lot of time too, is that the citizens shouldn't be able to carry weapons that are better than what the military carries. That's not true either. Yes, the British Army carried smoothbore muskets, usually called the Brown Bess, and the Americans carried, for the most part, smoothbore muskets just like the Brown Bess, sometimes captured Brown Besses, sometimes from other countries. But many of the Americans also had long guns, what they called rifles. Sometimes these are referred to as Kentucky rifles, sometimes as Pennsylvania rifles. These had longer barrels, and they had rifling inside the barrel, which meant that when you fired the musket ball, it would spin or be more accurate, and because of the long barrel, it had longer range. That's why the American riflemen were infamous for picking off British officers from their horses. You've all seen the movies of, Napoleon or the 18th century, even sometimes the Civil War, and you see the officer riding in front of his men on a horse. You could do that with smoothbore muskets because, when you shot, you never knew where the ball was going to go. It could go right, it could go left, it could go up, it could go down, and each time it would go a different direction. But rifled muskets, these Kentucky or Pennsylvania rifles, were fairly accurate out to, over 100 meters, sometimes more. You could pick a guy off the horse. So if you rode around on your horse, if you were a British officer in front of the American line before the battle, you might get one of these musket balls in your head, and you were dead. So actually, many of the Americans, referred to on the battlefield as the riflemen, Daniel Morgan, the rifleman, had these long, more accurate weapons. So many of the American militia units actually were better equipped than the British soldiers. So this idea even that we have today that nobody should have a weapon that's better than what the military carries really doesn't make a lot of sense if you understand what was going on at the time. So they understood that the question of arms and how you define arms would change over time. It could be something electric, it could be a phaser like they have in Star Trek. All these things under a Second Amendment would be covered. If they had said musket, they'd all be gone. And that's why they avoided using that term, because they knew things were going to change, because they knew their history and they knew they had changed in the past. These men were very intelligent. The last thing I want to touch on is the significance of the Second Amendment in relationship to the First. Now, there are memes floating around where people say the reason we have a Second Amendment is to protect the First Amendment. In many ways, that's actually true. If you look at the First Amendment, well, it's very important. It comes first. Look at the first word of the First Amendment, and what does it say? Congress. Congress shall make no law, etc., respecting the establishment of religion, yada, yada, yada. Basically, the First Amendment limits Congress. It doesn't limit the states. Now, we've interpreted things and there have been other amendments passed since which broaden the power of the federal government, which is a whole other question and a whole other video. But at the time this is passed, you have to understand, I think 3 of the states actually had official religions. But that's supposed to be outlawed by the First Amendment. No, because it just says Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of a religion or the free exercise thereof. It doesn't say anything about what the states are doing. So the people at the states were perfectly willing to ratify the First Amendment because it didn't really apply to them. Almost all the states at the time, of the 13 states, had religious tests. For example, in North Carolina, where I lived a long time, until I think the 1870s, you could not hold public office unless you were a professing Christian. Now, that would be at odds with the First Amendment today, but it wasn't considered at odds with the First Amendment then, because the First Amendment begins with the word Congress. The Second Amendment does not. It doesn't say Congress shall make no law to infringe the rights of the people. So basically, in many ways, while the Second Amendment comes second, it's broader in its scope, and it's the first of the amendments to apply to all the people of the country, not just to the state governments, and not just to the Congress itself, the federal Congress. This refers to the people, and it gives them the right to bear arms, which had just been used as a colonial right to get rid of the British. So in many ways, the Second Amendment is there to protect the First. If Congress abridges these freedoms and breaks the First Amendment, the Second Amendment is there right behind, and it's the First Amendment that applies to everybody in the country, whereas the First Amendment does not. That's what makes the Second Amendment so important. It may not be the First Amendment listed, but it's the First Amendment listed that applies to the people as opposed to the federal government. And that's important to keep in mind when you want to understand the importance and the centrality of the Second Amendment to what was happening at the time. In the next set of videos, what I'm going to start talking about is what was going on at the state level. And the state I'm going to talk about first is Virginia, which was the California of its day. It was the biggest, it was the most powerful, it was the most important, it was the most central of all the states. But that's for the next video. If you like this video, please leave a comment, give it a thumbs up, share the video with your friends, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification buttons so you'll know when I post new videos. And until the next time, I am out of here.